Hello, Terry Draper there in Toronto. Nice to talk to you.
Nice to be here, Nick. It's a long way, but I am here.
Now, look, Terry, let's start at the start. I want to ask you how you got interested in music. Were you from a musical family, or how did it all start?
Actually, that's an interesting question. It was an extremely unmusical family. It was a North American nuclear family is the way I describe it. My parents liked to watch Gilligan's Island and Bewitched and other programs without substantive interest. And there was this band, the Beatles, in 1963-64, in my formative years when I was 12 or 13. I think that gives my age away, Nick. But nonetheless, the Beatles came along and just spangled me. And I'd already had a record collection of 45s, and I was listening to the Ronettes and all the Phil Spector stuff. The Crystals, He's a Rebel was one of my favorite songs. And all of a sudden, this band came from England, and it was like so totally cool. The idea of playing music became like a possibility. And I got my first set of drumsticks around that time, and wandered around my neighborhood tapping on telephone poles and anything I could find.
Why the drums, Terry?
I think there was something charming about playing the drums. It's part of my nature, actually. I play hockey, and I became a goalie in hockey. 40-odd years ago when I started playing goal. And when I played baseball here in Toronto, I was a back catcher. And it turns out that those things, the back catcher, the goalie, and the drummer, they're all driving the train. They're all the pivotal point of their individual entities. And I didn't decide that. It's come to me later in years that these are the things. Like if you go see a band any night, Nick, and the drummer's hot and everybody else is sort of sloppy and it's not happening, the band rocks. If you go and see a band and everybody plays note on and the drummer's not in the pocket, the band sucks. And it's the same with playing goal or being the back catcher at a baseball game. You live and die by those things. And for some reason, I just gravitated to that responsibility of those things.
So when you bought these early records, did you listen out for the drums? Did you have any hero drum players?
Well, no, not till Ringo came along, and he just blew me away. And I started playing the drums, and then I got into all sorts of other bands and different things, and over the years, Ringo has still rung a clear bell to me because unlike most drummers, he knows when to shut up and just play the beat. And when it's time to play a fill and come to the forefront, he plays it with gusto, and he nails it. He always plays the drum fill like he's falling down a set of stairs. So he introduces a bit of confusion coming up to the chorus, so that when you get to the chorus, the reward is that much greater.
Speaking of Ringo, we've had Ringo on the show. My co-host Mark Kopolov interviewed him, and he kept on making fun of Mark Kopolov's name, Mark Blopolov. Besides being a good drummer, he's got a bit of a sense of humour as well.
You know what? I remember reading a great article by Ringo, or a documentary or something, and somebody was asking him about the making of Sgt. Pepper's, probably one of the most astounding albums of our lifetime. And Ringo's comment was, "Oh yeah, 1967. That was the year I learned to play chess." And that's indicative of his humor. I've never met the man, but I'm a really big fan. And there's lots of other great drummers out there. But when it comes to pop music and playing it right down the pipe and knowing when to not play or to just sit back in the pocket and drive the train, Ringo's your man.
Now, Terry, back to you. So you get your drum kit, and I suppose you become proficient. So when did playing with bands start? Because I've got here you started in high school and eventually...
Yeah, in 1965 I was in a band with John Wallace-Chuck, who was also in Klaatu with me. Actually, he was the driving force and the prolific songwriter of that band. And him and I were in a variety of bands,
what was that?
4 of them.
What was that one called there, Terry, the first one?
The first one we had was called JP and the 5 Good Reasons.
Okay.
Now, is that the worst name you've ever heard for a band?
I think you would have changed it quite promptly.
Well, and we did promptly. We changed it, and we got into the Animals, Eric Burden and the Animals. And I think we became the first clone band in the world, because our repertoire was nothing but songs by the Animals, and we called ourselves the Tracks, as in Animal Tracks.
Oh, I see. Yes.
Stay with me, Nick. We're on a ride here, Nick. You got to stay with me. Then there was some rhythm and blues bands and different things, and then Wallace-Chuck faded out of the playing live scene and these little bands doing cover songs, and started writing and recording with his cheesy little tape recorder in his basement at his parents' house in the late 60s. And it was a year or 2 later that I stopped playing in bands and joined him. Actually, I can remember the day because it was January 69, I think, or December 68, and some British fella had told me about this band. If you ever hear of them coming to town, you must go see them. And they were playing at the Rock Pile on Sunday night for $3, and I went to see them. They were called Led Zeppelin, and they just blew my mind. I was playing the blues with the band, like rhythm and blues and the blues, and I'd never heard anybody. Their first song when they came on stage was You Shook Me, and I'd never heard the blues so down and dirty and so powerful with Bonham behind the kit. He is the quintessential drummer of all time. Ringo's great, but Bonham is the man. Guy can lay a rhythm down with one hand and infer all of the things that you should be hearing. He's amazing. And so I saw them, and that was at the point where I said, you know what? Being a drummer's just not enough. And I borrowed an acoustic guitar, and shortly after bought a piano and began teaching myself how to play these instruments so that I could write songs and understand why I get shivers up my spine when Lennon says no reply. I wanted to know why I got those shivers. And I finally figured it out after all these years.
And what was there to figure out?
Well, it's just the way it's all about songwriting. It's the way... It's just like writing a paragraph or a sentence or a chapter in a book. It's all about the setup and the punctuation and the exclamation marks and how you make people anticipate and wait. And it's the what's the word I'm looking for? It's like the irony that you can create with music that you can do with words. And when you can make the words and the music ring true together, that's the ultimate. Next time you hear no reply, when he comes to the chorus and said, I nearly died, and then he says it again, and they don't change the chord, they just change the root of the chord. They just change the bass note, and it gives you shivers. And I wanted to understand how that happens. How do you do that? I spent the last 40-odd years trying to figure out. The more you learn, the less you know.
That happened once before. Hey, that sounds like a good opening for a song.
That is a good title. Let me jot that down.
This happened once before. Anyway, all right, so you're together with John and you're playing music and all that. How did D. Long come into the scene? Because he was a future Klaatuan. I hope that's the right word.
Yeah, that's an interesting story. We were... John had dropped out of the scene, our local little scene of playing in bands, and I was in a rhythm and blues band called The Innocence of Virgil Scott. Virgil and I are still good buddies after 40-odd years, and we played a Battle of the Bands in May 1968, and we came in third, unfortunately. The band that came in second was called The Polychromatic Experiment, And they were playing Iron Butterfly and Born to Be Wild and also Inagata Vita, all that real psychedelic stuff, which I was trying to get out of the rhythm and blues and move into the whole psychedelia thing because it fascinated me. But here I was. Anyway, as things would happen, my band, The Innocence of Virgil Scott, and Dee's band, The Polychromatic Experiment, got picked up by the same booking agent at this Battle of the Bands, and we spent the next 6 months playing together. You know, Friday and Saturday night, we'd go up the road and play. The two bands would play the same venue. Friday night here, Saturday night there, and then the following week the same thing in different towns around Toronto, and got to know all these guys, of course. And when John and I got serious, and I finally stopped playing in bands, we got serious about writing songs and trying to really make music, we needed a guitar player. And after a pile of auditions that didn't pan out, I said, I know this guy. And I met him a year or so ago, and he's amazing. Guy writes his own songs, plays guitar and keyboard, and let me give him a call. And that's what happened. We formed a band called Mud Cow that was playing all originals, and that lasted for a few months, maybe 6 months, until the money ran out, or there was no money at all, and in order to get a gig, we had to play Jumpin' Jack Flash and Proud Mary, and we started doing that in order to keep the band going, and then it died a death because that's what we were all trying not to do. And so that died, and then John and Dee got back together when John got a gig at a studio as a tape-op, and they started Klaatu, and then called me up and said, hey, it'd be really nice to have a real drummer and not these session guys. What do you think? So we started recording and made a bunch of records.
Now, look, I've got a very important question for you, Terry. Now, who won that Battle of the Bands? Because they would have been a better band than Klaatu, because they came first, and your band came third, and Dee's came second.
The band was called, that won the Battle of the Bands. You're good, Nick. The band that won the contest was called the Hudson's Bay Company. They won it because one of them in the band played the accordion, and they did this spectacular version of the Young Rascals song, How Can I Be Sure?
Yes, I know that.
Do you know that song?
Yes.
Whenever I'm away from you, I want to die. Okay, that's enough. They nailed this song and won the contest, and we came in a paltry third. But as the story goes, the highlight of that day was meeting Dee.
They recorded it. I've heard that name before, the Hudson Bay. But anyway.
Hudson's Bay Company?
Yeah.
You may have, but being here in Canada, and that's where the Hudson's Bay Company was formed. Now, today in Canada, it's called The Bay. I think it's the longest running store in North America. It used to be called the Hudson's Bay Company. It's where they took their name from, and now it's just called the Bay. But the band, I didn't meet any of the people and never heard from any of them again, to my knowledge.
Maybe they were just a front for the Hudson's Bay Company, just to get more publicity for the store. Yeah. But anyway, we're on to Klaatu now, and well, look, the reason why we're talking to you, Terry, is the albums have held up really well, and there was the initial publicity, but the rest of the albums, you did 4 other albums as Klaatu. I think they're just as good. My personal favourite is Sarami Suit. I think the debut, from my opinion, I think that's the best album, but Sarami Suit, Endangered Species I have an affinity with. But so you were just a little Canadian trio. How did you manage to get to Capitol Records? I mean, that was the Beatles record company in North America, wasn't it?
Well, that is the story, actually. John got a job working with Terry Brown at Toronto Sound Studios. Terry Brown is the producer, who did Rush, all the early Rush stuff, a local band called Max Webster, and a bunch of other Canadian bands of notoriety. And he'd cut his teeth as a tape-op, or assistant engineer, if you will, in England. And he grew up in the mid-'60s and the late '60s working with all kinds of bands like Traffic and I'm not sure who else, the Moody Blues and the Animals. I mean, he was there. He was a part of the scene. So he left England and came to Canada and got his own thing going. And he had a good friend, Frank Davies, who was also from England. Frank had a little record label called Daffodil Records, and he signed us up to do a couple of singles. And then he released our album in 1976, August, I believe. And he was quite shocked to find out that there were no pictures of the band, in fact, no names. And our byline at the time, our motto, if you will, was, let the music speak for itself. In the mid-'70s, everybody was into the hype of rock and roll. If you were recording and Mick Jagger walked by your studio, he got a credit. And everybody had the pictures going with their scarves on, a la Aerosmith, and their hair blowing in the wind. It was just, it was less about the music and more about the musicians. And our theory was, in recording every one of those songs we ever made, was that it's all about the song. The song is everything. And we tried to make each song sound like we thought it wanted to be. We gave it a life of its own and tried to maximize each song. So if the song didn't require a lot of drumming, well, there wouldn't be any. And if it didn't need a guitar, then Dee wouldn't be playing. If it required piano and just a string set, an orchestra, that's what we would do. So the musicians became secondary to the songs themselves. And what was your question, Nick? I'm sorry.
I mean, that sounds quite radical, and a big corporation like Capitol Records, well, A, how did you get signed to them? And I don't think they would have been very impressed with that sort of philosophy. They would have said, guys, we need your faces on the cover, we need you to tour, and okay, yeah, the songs, that's good, but...
I recall your question now.
Yeah.
So Frank Davies, who owned Daffodil Records, who'd signed us, we asked him to cut us a deal for a U.S. worldwide distribution. We had this album finished, and he went to see Rupert Perry in Los Angeles for EMI, and sold it. He sold it to Rupert, and Rupert said, "Well, how can I sell a band that doesn't have any pictures or any name?" Even Rupert didn't know who we were, or had met us, or knew our names, or he knew nothing. But and Frank apparently said to him, "Well, if Capitol can't sell this idea, nobody can." And they bit and put out the album, and of course 6 months later, in April or May, whenever it was, this guy in Rhode Island, a journalist for the Providence, Rhode Island Journal, proved that we were the Beatles.
He proved that you were the Beatles. Well done.
Well, not just a knockoff, not just a sound-alike, but in fact the Beatles reincarnate, recording under a new name.
You could have quit there, take all the laurels and just stop. No bigger compliment.
No bigger compliment indeed, Nick. I mean, it doesn't get any better. I mean, it's not just to be likened unto them, but to actually... And to think that Sgt. Pepper had only been made 10 years earlier in 67, and here we are in 77 with an album under our belt that people think we're the Beatles. We laugh. What are they, stupid? They all deaf? But it was a compliment nonetheless. If you listen to the first album, there are a couple of songs, Sub Rosa in particular. When John brought that song to the band, we went after the It's All Too Much George Harrison treatment that's on the Yellow Submarine CD. That's what we were trying to do, was to create that kind of atmosphere for that song, because that's what the song was calling for.
Dr. Marvello, who's singing that one, Terry?
That's another one of John's, and I hate to blow the whistle on John, but if you're a Turtles fan, and I'm a big Turtles fan, and there's Happy Together, and there's some really great songs, She'd Rather Be With Me, but there's one that was a relative minor hit in North America called You Showed Me.
Oh, you showed me how to do exactly what you do.
That's the one. The next time you listen to Dr. Marvello,
yeah,
keep You Showed Me in the back of your head, and you'll see where John was coming from. Oh, my love, and I were thinking you
right.
showed me how to do. Different melody, but it's that same creepy, crawly, sneaky kind of little thing. And John really loved that song and wanted to try to do something in that vein.
Because John there sounds to me like George Harrison, and George Harrison, of course, was a notorious song stealer.
Well, you know what? My favorite quote is from Keith Richards. Somebody asked him about stealing songs from himself, and his comment was, you know what? He says, Adam wrote the first song, and the rest of us have just been knocking it off ever since.
Terry, you co-wrote Calling Occupants, is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, I managed to find that out. Now, somebody in Klaatu, or all of you, or two of you, somebody is a sci-fi nut, because Little Neutrino and the whole Hope album is pretty science fiction-y, so who is that, or who?
All three of us, Nick. Dee wrote Little Neutrino. He wrote Anus of Uranus. He's a real sci-fi nut. But actually, John was the guy that came up with the name Klaatu, taken from the Michael Rennie movie in 1951, The Day the Earth Stood Still. He's the lead character who comes to Earth and says, hey, you people got to slow it down. We're going to annihilate you. And we were all sci-fi fans. And John and I used to do a lot of research, and we found this book called The Flying Saucer Reader. And in it was a message from the International Flying Saucer Bureau, when in fact they asked their members to recite this message, to memorize this message, and then around the world simultaneously they would lay down on their beds and mentally think the message that they memorized and try to reach the aliens. And John and I thought, what a great idea! What if we could get this on the air, and then the aliens will show up and save our planet? And the message actually, there's a book called The Flying Saucer Reader, and I forget the author, but it's in there, and the message is calling occupants of interplanetary craft. Calling occupants of interplanetary craft. We are your friends. Please come in peace, we beseech you. And it goes on and on. And John and I took that lyric verbatim and, transmuted it and added some stuff and colored it up, and wrote some melody and some chords for it, and tried to turn this into the ultimate world contact day.
It's very atmospheric. I love the start when you're going through the bushes.
Well, that's really interesting too, Nick, because this is the first song on our first album. We were debating on how to start the song, not just with the little bead mellotron thing. So what we decided to do was we recorded one of us walking through a little forest, and there was frogs and owls and stuff. We made all that up. We made this forest scene on the tape recorder, and had this fellow walking through the bush. And what does he find in the bush? He finds a record player. Well, we were having a lot of trouble getting our records played in Canada. We didn't sound Canadian.
That's right.
We decided that we would play our own record, and that's how the album started.
Terry, the album eventually did very well in the album charts in the US. Now, I assume Capitol would have said, hey, Klaatu boys, you go out and you do concerts.
Well,
you
Nick,
didn't.
You're right, absolutely right, but that was part of the original deal. No pictures, no names, no performances. This is a studio band who just wants to play in the studio. We do not tour, and you will not meet us. This is it. This whole mysterious thing was set up long before the Beatle rumor. It was part of our idea. And see, at the point when those records came out, we're like all 25 years old. So the idea of being 18 or 19 and looking for all the adulation from fans and all that stuff, that had pretty much worn off. Although we never had it, it was just saying, so what? Who needs that, Let's just make the music and have some fun. I'd still like to be able to go to the grocery store without having to sign autographs, I mean, do you want to be Mel Gibson and have to deal with, well, Mel's maybe a bad choice at this point in time.
Yes.
Although I got to tell you, I'm a really big fan. I even watched Mad Max a couple of weeks ago. I'm a big fan of Mel. Just that kind of notoriety. What kind of life do you have? You got security guards and all that. And we decided that we would try to avoid all that because we were a little more mature at 25, and obviate that crap and just like make music and make money.
That Klaatu is a great album, great songs, and, well, it was commercially successful. Now, what you do, the next album is Hope, and just by coincidence, your son being in Sydney, I have a friend in Sydney who just loves that album, but it's a very, in my opinion, very dense concept album. So you have commercial success, and then what did you do? Did you just record it and you said to Capitol, here, Capitol, this is it, release it, no changes, no nothing? Is that how it happened?
That's how it came about, and I'll tell you why. Because the first album was released in August of '76 in Canada. I'm not sure when it was released in the U.S. and down under and the rest of the world. But by the time the Beatle rumor broke 6 months later, the Hope album was mostly finished. And John and I, we'd worked closely all through the 60s together, and we were neighbors, in fact, went to high school together, and we'd always wanted to do a concept album. I mean, albums like In the Court of the Crimson King, and In Search of the Lost Chord, and The Birdman Suite by MacDonald and Giles from King Crimson, these albums were really powerful for us. The idea of making a record that had a theme, and Sgt. Pepper is a very loose theme, albeit, and Magical Mystery Tour is just as loose, but the concept album was really powerful motivator for us. And after we finished the first album, which was made over 3 years as a collection of singles that we released, and made some interesting album tracks like Little Neutrino. But still, Hope was almost finished when this Beatle rumor broke. It wasn't like we could just all of a sudden follow it up with another collection of pop tunes. It is what it is. And we went to England in January of '77 and recorded the London Symphony on it. And that was a fabulous experience. And there was 80-odd of them.
How'd you fit them all in?
There was a room full of these guys with reeds and bows and mouthpieces. They were all blowing and honking and scrubbing away. It was spectacular that they would play to our music. It was very exciting.
Unfortunately, though, it wasn't as commercially successful as the Klaatu album.
But like I say, it was too little too late. We were already committed to this record, which is what John and I had wanted to do all of our musical lives, was do a concept album. And I was reading in one of my astronomy books one day about the solar system, and there's an asteroid belt out beyond Mars and between the next planet, whatever the hell that is, I've forgotten, Nick. But there was this guy, and he came up with this thing called Bohm's Law, that the planets, given the size of our sun and where the planets are, they will be not equidistant, but there's a formula for where planets should be with a sun our size. And there should be a planet where the asteroid belt is. So I came up with this great idea that there used to be a planet there, but these idiots blew themselves to pieces, and all that's left of their planet is this asteroid belt, and the lone surviving member of their race feels it is incumbent upon him to guide the space traffic through the detritus of his planet with his solar flare, the lighthouse keeper. And John grabbed a hold of the idea and wrote most of the music, and that's how the Hope album came about.
Now I understand it.
Okay, well, there you go. And it's actually based on some kind of science, believe it or not. And then, of course, it's time to make another record, because the Hope album had no commercial success. There were no top 40 hits. I mean, if there was anything, We're Off, which was, a very Beatle-y kind of little ditty about sailing, so to speak. So now what are we going to do? Well, then we decided to do Sir Army Suit and do a collection of pop tunes.
Like I mentioned before, it's my favourite. When the rain starts falling on routine day, right to the end, Silly Boys. I just love it as a collection of, maybe I'm just shallow and I couldn't get into Hope as much as I could.
No, we went out of our way to try and make a a collection of pop tunes that would garner some radio play, so that we could actually be comfortable and make a living making records. Didn't quite pan out the way we planned, Nick. You mentioned the rain and Routine Day, and John and I have been friends for almost 5 decades now. And Routine Day is my favorite John song.
Wow.
That song just melts me. The idea and the chord structure and the melody, it just blows me away. Every time I hear that song, I stop whatever I'm doing. God knows I don't listen to it very often, but it's my favorite, could be my favorite Klaatu song.
It's probably mine too. When I first heard it, I was probably too young to understand a routine day because I wasn't doing the 9 to 5 thing. But like I mentioned off air, Endangered Species, I just played Sarabi Suit over and over again, and I knew all the lyrics to a routine day because you guys were good. You put the lyrics in the record jacket.
We always did that. All 5 albums contain the lyrics. That's the whole story, you know. And one of the things we tried to do, we tried very hard to make it so that if there was a language barrier, if you were in Germany and buying our record, we were hoping that the idea and the message of the song, even if you couldn't understand English, you would get it. And that's one of the reasons bands like Pink Floyd are so successful, because their lyrics and their music melt together, and you get the whole idea. Dark Side of the Moon is not the best album ever made for no reason.
Now, look, Terry, you did 5 albums with Klaatu, and then in, I think, about 82, after Magenta Lane, you guys broke up. And I've got here that you went into roofing.
Well, when I was a young lad between bands back in the early 70s, the opportunity came along to not be broke. And somebody said, well, come on out with us, and we'll pay you to carry these bundles up on the roof. I was between bands and not as sharp as most people, and I said, okay. And then, I learned how to do that trade. And I did it throughout all the making of the Klaatu albums. Whenever I needed a few extra bucks, I'd go and put a roof on somebody's house or do a gazebo or a shed or whatever came along. And when the band collapsed, I went at it with a vengeance and set up my own company called Roofer Extraordinaire. That's kind of a French thing. I don't know if you guys are into that.
No, we can't speak French.
No. Well, nor can I. But it sounded like a good name for a roofing business.
Extraordinaire. That means salt.
Extraordinary.
Oh, really? Geez, a connection there, huh?
Yeah, there you go. Huh?
It took me a while to get that one, though, but I got it.
French 101.
Terry, of course, you've done some solo material as well.
Yeah, I left the roofing business about 15, 20 years ago. It's a young man's job, and I've been doing, over the years, I've had a number of jobs. I was a manager of a high-end club bar here in Toronto for 10 years, and I do decks and fences and the hardwood floor, just construction. You know, you know what, Nick? It's odd actually, because if you start with a pile of lumber and some nails and whatnot, and end up building a really nice little gazebo, it's not unlike having a blank sheet of paper in front of you sitting at the piano, and at the end of the day, you have written a song. The rewards are similar. Feeling is equally as gratifying, and I like building stuff. I don't know.
You're creating stuff, aren't you?
It's very creative, and you put your stamp on it. And that blank piece of paper was empty when you started, and now it has something on it that may or may not be fabulous. But it's the same as this backyard that you're working in, and you build this little gazebo, a little gingerbread work, and the cedar roof. And before the day started, there was nothing in the backyard. And now there is this little thing that you've created.
Speaking of creation, just before we started our little interview, you were working on your new album?
Yeah, I have a new CD. It's almost complete. It's called Stranded with Special Guests, because I wouldn't want to be stranded alone, Nick.
No, it's a bit boring.
I've got 3 or 4 solo CDs out prior to this over the last 15, 20 years. And I've decided on this one that nobody should have to listen to me caterwaul for an hour. I should force some of my friends on them. I've got 3 or 4 guest vocalists coming in, done a song or 2 each. Just friends of mine, nobody of notoriety, except, of course, for Virgil Scott, who I played with in a band in 1968.
Yes, as you mentioned.
He was JP in the 5 Good Reasons. His real name is Jimmy Pitkin, though I'm telling tales out of school now. So this new CD it smells a bit of Klaatu, but it's also very Beatle-y, and one of my great influences has been Peter Sarstedt. Followed this man's career. You familiar with him, Nick?
He came to Melbourne about 15, 20 years ago, and he did a show and went to see it, and he hung around afterwards, and I got my Best of Peter Sarstedt record signed by him. So there you go, a bit of a fan.
Oh, well, it blows me away that you even know who he is. I have all of his records, and I have a dozen CDs, and him and I have corresponded via email, and he actually wrote me a letter once, a fan letter, because I sent him a fan letter. He responded. He's just been a real influence on me. I can remember living in Yorkville back in the 68, 69. Yorkville was kind of like the Haight-Ashbury of Toronto, and it was, a bunch of hippies and all that stuff, and I am actually a flower child, Nick. I can't
no, don't. Oh, you should deny it these days.
And his song, Where Do You Go To, My Lovely, used to come on the radio all the time. And we went out and found the album and bought it, and it's got some great songs on it. I Am a Cathedral, and all sorts of songs. And I've followed this man's career ever since. And the only fan letter I've ever written was to him, and he responded, and I have a great collection of his stuff. And that whole, it's a European folk style with full orchestra that really strikes a nerve in me. So there's a smattering of that in the stuff I do that still has a bit of a Beatle sense, and sometimes I feel like I want to be in King Crimson, so I get the Mellotrons going. And of course the Klaatu influence. There's a couple of songs that sound like they should have been on a Klaatu album. So I just keep tinkering away, and putzing around, and God bless the Carpenters.
Yes.
For recording Calling Occupants.
They're bigger than ever these days.
Yeah, well, you know what? They're really big on the Pacific Rim and the UK. Not so much in North America. In North America, It's kind of like the Osmonds. They have this thing, even though their music is fabulous. It's really funny that I had the Carpenters' greatest hits on my 8-track player in my old Jeep back when we were making Sir Army Suit. And the guys in the band would laugh at me John and Dee would laugh at me all the time, because I'm listening to Rainy Days and Mondays Always Get Me Down. I love that shit. That schmaltzy music, the Burt Bacharach stuff, those fabulous chord progressions, that stuff rips my heart out. And then the Carpenters turn around and record Calling Occupants. Well, this was almost as beautiful a scenario as being likened unto the Beatles reincarnate. This was one of the great gifts, and it's needless to say, it's been relatively financially rewarding, and that's been a good thing, and I love that.
They're more respected than ever because they didn't get that much respect. But then again, when you die young, you always get a bit more extra respect, don't you?
Yeah, well, I missed that boat, Nick.
Poor old Karen didn't, though. Karen Carpenter.
No, she didn't, and that's a tragedy. Speaking of Calling Occupants and covers, I got an email last week that there's a band from Down Under, and they're called Unitopia. Are you familiar with them?
No.
Oh, okay. They're from Australia, and they have a few albums out, and their latest release is a collection of anthems, I guess you'd call it. There's they do some Supertramp and some Procol Harum and David Bowie. I'm not sure what the list is, but anyway, they've recorded Calling Occupants.
Congratulations again.
Yeah, and we'll see what we get. I haven't heard it. It's supposed to be released this month, actually. Might want to look up Unitopia and see what that's all about. I went to their website. It looks pretty good. I didn't hear anything, but we'll see what we get, Nick.
Well, we'll look forward to that new cover of Calling Occupants, and we'll look forward to Stranded as well.
Stranded.
Stranded, your solo album. You know, Terry, it's
well,
been...
Nick,
it's great being...
when we're done...